this. My name's Todd Rubin. I'm a science fiction writer, and I just wanted to preface this with sort of how this idea for this panel came about. It was sort of a mixture of a couple of events. One is this last year or two, there's been a number of books that have come out that I've found particularly fascinating. There was the Mark Rich book. There was the biography of Robert Heinlein. And then at the beginning of the year, I started on a little project where I went ahead and started collecting and reading all of what is essentially the Golden Age era Astoundings, beginning with July 1939. And blogging about it, I call it the vacation of the Golden Age. And the comments that I got from that were pretty fascinating, and I realized that there's a lot of history that is out there that I didn't know about and that doesn't seem to be captured in books in any way other than orally, people who were there or people who knew people who were there. And it kind of got me thinking about the value of this hidden history to the genre and to the body of work and to the fans and to the historians and things like that. So that's sort of where the generation of this idea came from. And I got really lucky that I got a great group of panelists here. I'm pretty new at this, so they're going to do most of the talking, I think. And I will start things off with two questions and then ask the panelists to introduce themselves and address these questions. And the questions that I'd like to start with are how do you go about finding this? Where do you go to find this history? How do you know the things that you know in this history? And the second one, and it's probably somewhat more important, and particularly with what I found with just people commenting on things, is how do you verify it? How do you know that what you're hearing or what you found is valid? Is you hear conflicting stories, or there's lots of apocryphal stories out there? So how do you verify these things? Do you want to start, Barry?
Am I supposed to introduce myself?
Yeah, go ahead.
We introduce ourselves,
yeah,
and then
yes.
I am Barry Malzberg. Right? We'll do the introductions first. Then okay, that's my suggestion.
Yes, no, that sounds good.
My name's Fred Lerner. I've been a historian and a bibliographer in this field for entirely too long. I was one of the founders of the Science Fiction Research Association. Did my doctoral dissertation on essentially how science fiction became respectable, and published my findings in a book called Modern Science Fiction in the American Literary Community. And I've written history on some other topics in my time.
I'm Eileen Gunn. I write short stories. I also have been working for the last nearly 20 years on a biography of Avram Davidson.
Oh, cool.
I'm Darrell Schweitzer. I've done a little bit of everything. You know, I've helped edit magazines. I've written a lot of fiction. I've written. I think what's relevant here is that I've written a lot of essays and essays and reviews. I'm a regular contributor to the New York Review of Science Fiction. And I've been a regular contributor to a lot of reference works. There are a lot of encyclopedias in this field that'll have an article or two by me in them. So I guess this sort of makes me a kind of traveling expert.
All right, so Barry, do you want to start the two questions again? Where how do you know the history that you know this stuff that doesn't necessarily get into print, and how do you know it's true, or how do you verify it?
I think we have to back up, Jamie. I think we have to hit what in the old days was called the backspacer on some archaic tool called the typewriter. And look at this. Let's first ask, do we need to know this, what you call the unwritten history? What is the value of learning it? If we knew it, by definition, it cannot be known, but if we knew it, would it deepen or obscure our understanding of science fiction? I claim a certain priority here. I believe I'm the first person to use the phrase, the true unwritten history of science fiction, in a review in 1974 in Geiss's Accursed Science Fiction Review. I have priority on the phrase. I might even have priority on the idea being, as I presented it, that science fiction could not be understood as it should be, even by the casual reader, unless you knew the true unwritten history. I don't want to hijack the panel. I don't want to in any way extend. I will just, what is the true unwritten history? Give examples, some of you might ask. What are we talking about? So let's talk about what we talk about when we talk about the true unwritten history. Examples. Who was Judith Merrill screwing in the early 50s? Was any of it with her collaborators, and did it affect her career choices? What was the state of the Fred Cole, Judith Merrill marriage and divorce, which utterly stripped and divided in irreconcilable ways the science fiction community? What drove Walter Miller into a relationship with Judith Merrill and then out entirely of science fiction? What effect, if any, did this have upon his work? How did Pohl and Kornbluth get along? How did that affect the writing of Gravy Planet and Gladiator at Law? Philip K. Dick had 5 wives, innumerable girlfriends, and an income of about $2,000 a year in the 50s. Did this have any effect on his work? Did it not? If it did not, why not? These are all questions which I would consider not only significant, but irreplaceable to any serious scholarly study of our little genre. But the true unwritten history of science fiction, tautologically, is unwritten. So I return to my question, should we know it? That is a priority. Your 2 questions you ask are simpler. But the answer to the first question is Rashomon. Everybody has the story. Everybody has her own version of the story. And the second is, how do you verify it? In the way that you heard the story, that is, and think of the story. It is essentially unverifiable. But that's science fiction for you, and that's the beginning of what I think, and I've struggled with this issue, to no real conclusion for 40 years. Other thoughts?
Well, I think to borrow a term from the anthropologists, you've got to be a participant observer if you're going to write any kind of useful history of the science fiction field. You have to know, I entirely agree with Barry, you have to know the kind of secret history that, the unwritten history that he's talking about. Yes, some of that is written down in some places. I was once doing some research in the archives of a university library, which is a substantial collection of science fiction writers' papers, and found some material on exactly some of the points you were talking about, which I felt had no damn business being out there where people like me could see it. I spoke at one point to some of the people involved who apparently had much less concern about privacy issues than I would have had. But the point is, yeah, some of this stuff is written if you know where to find it, and deliberately not going to tell you where I found it, because I don't think that stuff should be out there and seen by anybody. But most of what you're going to learn about this kind of thing is from hanging around with the people that were involved. One reason I have a little bit of confidence in my ability to write something useful about the history of science fiction is that I've been involved with all these people for going on 50 years. And it's not just a matter of being involved to the point where you hear the stories, but also involved to the point where you know enough about the people involved that you can have some sense about who you can trust, how far, and about what. I would maintain that somebody without this kind of background, no matter what that person's academic credentials might be, is simply not going to be able to tell the story.
So you have to be a special person to absorb this information. An ordinary person could not read these documents and understand them, is what
Well,
you're
part of
saying.
it is they aren't documents. A lot
Well,
of it is-
documents in the
a lot of
sense
it
you
is-
read letters. You
Well-
had before you written material.
Yeah, but I'm also, that's part of it, but part of it also is a matter of what you would have to call lore. I could see a letter from so-and-so to so-and-so in which a couple of third parties were mentioned. But unless I happen to know something about who was sleeping with whom there, I might not be in a position to understand the biases and calculate the degree of faith I could put in a particular written account. Whether it was an account in a private letter that wound up in a university library collection, or an account that somebody wrote in a fanzine, or in a memoir, or something else like
So
that.
presumptively, you are putting every biographer out of business.
No, this is when
Let us say, if I
Before
want
we
to
get
write a
into arguing
biography.
about it, could we finish
Yeah.
our statements?
By all means.
I have my own opinions on these things, and but I'd actually rather discuss a larger question, which is what's the difference between the history of the field and the history of the individual writer. I'm writing a biography. That's a history of the writer and who the writer was and what the writer did, how the writer worked, in the context of the larger history of the field. What were other people doing? What was the market like? Most of this stuff is not well written down. There are a couple of major books about the history of science fiction in the English language, specifically in the US and in Britain. But the subject is so big, and once you start talking about markets, so small, really. There's a minutia there, and it varies over very short periods of time. That the question is, what is the history of science fiction? There isn't one, and perhaps we can only know history by cutting up into small pieces and looking at it, but we can't tell the whole history. There'll always be part of the history that's not told. There's part of all history that's not told. One, I'd like to differentiate between biography and history. And I have heard the question of what is too personal to tell resides in both what the information is, that is, how does it relate outside, what does it beyond gossip? How does it relate to history, as Barry was saying? And what of this if you're talking about a person, did the person involved think about their own privacy? Writing about Avram, I want to respect Avram. I want to respect his privacy in certain areas. And I also know that from reading all this stuff, he wanted his story told. He wanted people to know about his life. He saved everything. He took notes on everything. He wrote everything down. There were 2 items in his history that when I started doing this, I talked to his former wife, Grania Davis, and she said, there are 2 things about Avram that I'm going to tell you 2 secrets, but you can't use this information. And I said, well, then you better not tell me that information. And she said, well, no, if you can find it somewhere else, then you can have it, you can use it, but you can't use it on my say-so. I thought, well, that's very good. She's sort of heading me in the right direction. And it wasn't horrible, scandalous stuff, particularly. It was personal stuff about Avram. And it was very useful. It was useful to be headed in that direction. And yes, I found substantiation for everything in Avram's papers that he deliberately saved. He wanted people to read. He would have notes to his biographer in his manuscripts. To my biographer, I think you'll be especially interested in the editorial comments. I was also present at an interview done by another writer who was writing a biography/social history, interviewing not Judith Merrill, but another woman writer of the early 50s, who started out very explicitly and surprisingly started the interview herself by saying, well, Damon Knight said I screwed everybody in the Futurians, but I didn't screw all of them. And so she delineated who she had screwed in order to get the record straight. that didn't make it into the social history. But it was a surprising thing to have people want, I mean, what Damon said was not necessarily so. I didn't go back and check the Futurians to see what Damon said, though. I've never known Damon to tell me a falsehood. The problem is that there's a difference between falsehoods and personal opinion. I interviewed a lot of people for the Alva story. Everybody is, it's like the blind man and the elephant. How do you tell the truth? How do you tell what the difference is? What's proper to talk about? What's true? What's relevant? Those are all different questions.
Well, I would just want to say that I think that actually most of the history is, it's the story, it's the human history, it's what it was like, what it felt like. So frequently, for example, perceptions are more important than statistics. You know, the facts are one thing, but in real history, let's say it's the distinction between a series of data about the Spanish Civil War and George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. You know the distinction. You know, one is the human story. This is what's like I was there. That's the real basis. And if you weren't there, and you just heard it from somebody, I think the most important thing, I guess, in methodology is you have to make a very clearly know where to draw the line between what I know and what what I've just been told. I mean, I'll give you a specific example. The late George Sithers used to speak with admiration of John W. Campbell and about John W. Campbell's professionalism. And what he said was, John W. Campbell continued to do business with the man who walked off with his wife and the man who jilted his stepdaughter. Now, George knew all of the people in question. Basically, George knew John Campbell quite well. He knew George O. Smith quite well, and he knew Reynold Garrett. And he told me this story more than once. It was one of his, one of those stories. If you know somebody long enough, you know all their stories. Well, I know this one. But I have to recognize that, for me, it's just a story. I can't quite make that connection to, I know this is true. I just know that people who knew the right people say this is true, but there's still something missing there. The final connection is missing. So if I were to, well, I'm not writing a biography of John Campbell, and if I were, I would want to talk to the stepdaughter. I think it's the only person in question who might be still around. But I would have to make that important distinction that I don't actually know this is true. I've just heard about it from good sources. Or another very funny example, if you've read, actually it's in the introduction to Niven's Laws, the famous story of Larry Niven and the German translator. If anyone knows that story, which is the one about when Jerry Pournelle was introduced to his German translator, who had completely butchered one of his books in German, apparently. Took all the ideological parts out. It was a book called The Mercenary. And some very funny things happened about. I can tell you, actually, I instigated the entire incident. That is to say, I was talking to the German, and he was saying, I translated this Jerry Pournelle novel. I made him sound like a fascist. And I said, keep your voice down, he's right behind you. And the guy turned around and introduced himself, and funny things happened. And I can tell you, I witnessed about half of it. I've heard more about what happened after I'd actually left the room. But so if people ask me about this story, I can say, yeah, I know half of that one. But I think you always have to know where to put the brakes on.
So somebody, it might have been brought up another interesting point then, which is there's clearly, I mean, from my standpoint and what I'm looking at, and part of it's just out of interest, but there's clearly some academic value to this. What value or importance, if any, does this have for just a fan and a reader having this information out there and available? Does it have a value? Does it add to the work?
I think I know something it does. Which is, we finally actually settled recently through the researches of Mike Ashley, the name of the lawyer whose specialty was suing Hugo Gernsback. That had been part of the lore of this field for a long time, and it made a great story. But there really was a woman named Ione Weber in New York whose specialty was suing Hugo Gernsback. She made a living doing this. And it helps you, it actually really does help you. Well, she spent, say, a substantial amount of her income in the Great Depression, because suing somebody for say $700 in 1935 is suing somebody for like about $10,000 today, and 10% of that you can almost live on. And so, but it turns out this is really true. And among other things, the relevance is that when you understand that the business practices really were like this, and that Gernsback was that incompetent, was being sued every other week, it helps you understand why his whole vision of science fiction collapsed the way it did, why his magazines became marginalized, why all the competition got up and walked. I mean, all its contributors got up and walked with the competition. When you understand that it's actually true that Stanley Weinbaum was never paid a dime for the Martian Odyssey because Gernsback was a crook, then things come into focus, and things start to make sense. And the extreme dominance of Astounding over the rest of the field in the middle 30s begins to make sense.
Let me generalize from your specific example. A lot of the appeal of science fiction, to many of us, I believe, is that in addition to the merits of each individual story, the literature as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The fact that science fiction writers have been in dialogue with each other and with their predecessors for the better part of 100 years now means that you have something that is a interconnected living literature. That being the case, then there's a reason for somebody who has a love for this literature or a strong interest in it to want to see not just the nodes but the edges, to want to know something about not only the individual stories but about the connections, the intellectual and social connections among the stories and their creators, the way that stories relate to each other and so forth. And in order to know this, you have to know something about the people that created these stories and the environment in which they did that creation. I think this isn't just limited to science fiction. I think this is equally true, and a lot of what you were saying before, I think, is equally true of, say, understanding modern American poetry.
Well, all right. The Darrell raised the or you, Fred, I forget it. That do we need to know about these people, or does it not matter at all knowing about them in order to read their work? The man who should be on this panel is Michael Derder, who is the man in this room, in this building, who is best qualified to answer that. Is you, Mr. Derder.
I'm not on the panel.
As our acknowledged best, most important critic, at least for the general public in general terms, do you feel that knowledge of a writer's personal background is germane to your reviews? And my own small example, I did not know when I read Stanley Elkin's The Franchiser that Elkin had multiple sclerosis, and that this was, at least in medical terms, a viciously expository autobiographical portrait. So I read the novel again, and as they say about Agatha Christie's Murder of Roger Ackroyd, it's an entirely different novel read when you know this than when you don't. That was the experience I had. How do you feel?
Well, I guess I would agree that T.S. Eliot said all knowledge is good for a critic. The more you know, the better critic you can be. So in general, I'd like to know myself as much about a writer as possible to bring back whatever illumination it might offer to the work. That said, having grown up in the era of the new criticism, I still believe in the work of art as somehow an autonomous aesthetic object, and that a lot of this other information isn't as relevant as you might think it should be or could be or sometimes is. So that I'm torn. You can't deny what you know, But I still tend to judge the work of art as it stands, but I will bring to bear whatever information, knowledge, or gossip, even that might be useful to them. But it is a troubling question, and I'm not sure that this is the right answer. But as I say, I do tend to think about art as something that does have to survive the time and the author and the place, and thus all this personalia will eventually fall away from it, and it stands for what it is. When scholars go back to earlier times to understand things, they need to put it in context. So then you want to reapply it at the same time as a scholar. I think when you're writing the history of science fiction, it's useful to understand all the sexual connections and business relationships of these people, to understand where the work is coming from, and now all those human ways and those commercial ways. When you're a reader, I'm not sure that it really is of anything except sort of voyeuristic interest. It's if you're reading a great story, it's a great story if you know nothing about the author. And we don't know anything much about certain Elizabethan playwrights, for example, but the plays are still powerful. And I'm not sure that much more would be added if we did know a lot more about the
I think
I haven't thought this question out when you posed it to me here.
Well, you've got a column there, don't you? You've got a substantial essay. Your reflections on this subject, they're crucial, don't you think?
You're kind to say that. Thank you. All right. Eileen, you were saying something.
I think it depends on who you are and what you're reading, what you want to know for. As a writer, as a young writer, I read a lot of biographies of writers. I wanted to know how they work. I wanted to understand their work more deeply than just reading the work. I wanted to understand the work from outside and inside. And to me, that's why I'm working on Avram's story. He was a fascinating human being, and he wrote immense, ornate, wonderful things. And you think, how could somebody do all that? And partly you're thinking, how could I do all that? At my age, I guess I can't do all that, or I already have done it. It's too late, Eileen, to do that. I cannot be Avram Davidson. But it's interesting to figure out, just interesting to me, what made Avram? What all went into making him up? The surprises, the interesting things about researching someone's life are the surprises.
Also, I think writers have legends.
One last thing I wanted to add was Jerry, if I could be able to say something. I had a great friend of mine, a mentor of mine, named Robert Phelps. He's a wonderful book reviewer and critic, worked for the Herald Tribune. Some of you might know his book about Colette, Earthly Paradise, John Colette's other biographical writings. But he once told me, he said, there are only 3 important things to know about a writer. You know about his sex life or her sex life and sexual inclinations, the state of the person's health, and where their money comes from.
That's what this panel, that was my premise when I started to write about the true unwritten history. That you could not possibly, I don't know if Phelps was being self-mocking, or dead serious, amusingly cynical, but that was a conclusion to which I came. You couldn't understand science fiction unless you knew. You couldn't understand Phil Dick's novels until you understood the kind of life he was leading, the pressures economic and psychologically he was under, etc. You could not separate that.
Well, you can understand the generation of the novels, where they came from. But I think the novels then had a life of their own, beyond.
There's a difference. It
I'm
seems.
sorry, I don't mean to.
You shouldn't be sitting here. You should, don't talk.
I'll
change places with you in a wink if you like.
I think there's a difference that we have to look at between considering a given novel, story, text, whatever, as a work of art, and looked at from that particular point of view. Yes, you're right. However, if you were also looking at it from a more of a historical or social point of view, if, for example, you are interested in considering the thesis that modern American science fiction had a significant impact on the attitudes of some important segments of American society towards science, technology, what they could accomplish, what impact they should have on society and politics, and so forth. If you believe that this is a thesis that is worth investigating, then I believe it becomes important to look at the field as a whole, to look at the motivations, the backgrounds and the like of the people that were writing, reading, being influenced by it, and so on. So the question is really, what task are you setting yourself when you're looking at science fiction? And the answer to that question, I think, contributes to an answer of the question of how important is it to get this information?
I actually sort of have the same experience as Eileen, I think, is I sort of grew up reading not just science fiction, but a lot of the what was available, the biographies, the autobiographies, the histories, because I thought that was a way of learning how to do this. And so some of the value in this to me is there's nobody out there that really can come. You don't go to a school that says, here's how you become a science fiction writer. What it is learning from other people's experience to some extent, and that was where the value in some of that is for me. But Eileen, you're working on a biography. Is that, so now I'm thinking, for what history there is and what we can find, and what we decide maybe is appropriate to bring forward into the light, are biographies the right way to do that? Is it through criticism? What is the means for getting it out in front of the?
Well, there's no right way. It's all optional. You can do anything you want. Do what you're interested in. Research what you're interested in. Read what you're interested in. If you want to read a history of science fiction from a sort of conceptual point of view, there are books out there, as Aldous' book. There are ways of you can get that information. If you want to read about a particular artist, there's a lot of stuff on a lot of specific writers. The reason I'm doing this is that nobody has written anything on Avram. And the problem with Avram is, with writing this, is that Avram is a very complex person. There's a lot to research. There's a lot to know about. I've spent 20 years trying to catch up with Avram's level of knowledge in order to be able to write about what was part of his life.
Yeah, here's a thought for you. Will this change the way we read Avram?
No.
No, there are writers that we just cannot escape our conception of who they are. I mean, does anybody now read a story? Well, the three really good examples I can think of would be Philip K. Dick, H.P. Lovecraft, and Edgar Allan Poe. Does anybody read any of these writers without thinking of their conception of who these writers are? And let me also suggest that the reason that we get so many crackpot theories about Shakespeare is that people are driven crazy by the fact they can't get that image of who he was, and we really want it. I don't think we will ever read. Well, we'll never read Phil Dick again because now that we know about him, we'll always be seeing him and the works together. It'll take 1,000 years to separate the biography out.
What about people, though, who come to reading Phil Dick without ever having read it?
They have all that baggage, Fred. They have all that baggage. You can't read Hemingway, and by you I mean any junior high school kid, without picking up the mythos and the parodies and the successors and the social context. You can't read Hemingway. No one will ever read Hemingway the way he was read in 1923.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah, because you'll learn about it you'll start with the back cover blurb. And there is a lot of writers really deliberately create their own mythos. I mean, we point out that Samuel Clemens invented Mark Twain, who was his public persona, and we never get away from Mark Twain when we read his work. Jack London made a point of being who he was. There used to be this ideal of that the adventure writer was the manly man who had gone out there and done it. This is the whole idea between the pulp magazine and Adventure. All the writers were supposed to be genuinely authentic, and so they basically built up legends about it. And we can see in L. Ron Hubbard a failed example of this. A guy who's desperately trying to be Indiana Jones, and he's making up this elaborate lies and fantasies about himself because he's trying to create a legend. But the problem is there are too many parts in it, and it's the way you tell a compulsive liar. And this is a subject that also I think needs to be separated out in science fiction. The way you tell a compulsive liar. If somebody tells you one really extraordinary story, well, that's fine. When they tell you 20 extraordinary stories, you stop believing them. Well, there's one that just came across my mind recently as I was starting to write a review of that NESFA edition of Lester Del Rey. And we found out that Lester Del Rey, who wasn't who he said he was, and then you go back and look at, then I actually went back to Sam Moskowitz's Seekers of Tomorrow. I read the article about Lester Del Rey in there, and there's this extraordinarily melodramatic life about his story about Del Rey's early life and hardships and adventures and so on. I wonder if a word of that is true. Because, we now know that the guy had created a public persona for himself, and he changed his name, and he wasn't who he said he was, and so at that point, can we believe anything? He suddenly, but basically, it's possible that writers of themselves sometimes work fiction, of which the late F. Gunn McIntyre was the most extreme example in recent times. He was a work of fiction. We really know nothing about him.
Who was it?
Froggy McIntyre, F. Gunn McIntyre. Everything he said about himself couldn't be verified. Now, this is a guy I knew Froggy McIntyre for almost 30 years, and I cannot tell you could not really tell you his name, his age, his nationality, or really anything about him. He was the one who, and for example, but whenever you tried to check him out, he claimed to have a very close relationship with James Blish. He claimed he was virtually James Blish's adopted son in the Oxford days. And people always ask, George Sithers once asked James Blish's widow, he said, "Have you ever heard of this guy?" and she said no. But he was just too good. He was like Lord Dunsany's Jorkins. Was a character who was always telling stories he could never verify. And it might have been in a different circumstance. He might have been using another name. You just never pin down anything.
But then again, Mike, the question to you: after the journals, after the two major biographies, can you read Cheever the same way? How does John Cheever look to you? How does his fiction look to you now that you know the journals
I start off by saying all knowledge is useful, so you will use that. But I was thinking about that. I was thinking about just what Darrell was talking about.
What if he's a liar?
What if he's a what if you have you've been reading Lester Del Rey according to one vision of his early life from Sam Moskowitz, and then we learn another telling of what that life was really like. That's obviously going to change in some way something about our relationship to the fiction, but does the fiction still remain itself what it is, or is it in fact changed because it's one of these observer sorts of items?
Yeah, well, I did not ask. That's not a rhetorical question.
No.
It's a genuine inquiry.
Yeah.
Is the fiction the same? Is it diminished? In your view, is it untouched? That is, can it be perceived as separate from the man we thought we knew and of course we did not know? To what degree do they intersect? Did the family do the writer? They did their bank accounts a great service, as we know, but did they do John Cheever a service by releasing those journals?